What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the 21CD podcast. As always, I'm your ghost, John. If you'd like to support the show, and I hope you do, all you got to do is like and follow. And if you're a real go-getter, you can look in the description for my links to other places. I've got a Patreon and a website with some fun stuff to click on. Listen, we're going to be starting the lives up. After all this time, me saying it's going to happen, it's finally going to happen. We're going to be doing lives on YouTube at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time every single Friday. It's going to be me for the most part, and then my brother as well, who will be joining in from time to time. And we're also going to be having Patreon early access to these lives on Patreon for the Patreon supporters. But at 5:30, we're going to transition to YouTube so everybody can engage in the chat. And we can have some great discussions about the past episodes and future episodes and just conspiracy stuff in general, or whatever we want to talk about. I don't really care. It's going to be just time for us to get to know each other and hang out. So let's get into this week's episode. I had something tragic happen to me this past week, and it has nothing to do with my eye and everything to do with Tartaria, and specifically Tartaria in the United States. A lot of people believe that the Tartarian kingdom expanded and essentially came over to the U.S. as part of their empire, and they were sort of a global high-tech empire that spanned an insane amount of the planet. It was called Great Tartary, the Kingdom of Tartary, or simply Tartaria, which is what I'm going to be calling it. Nowadays, we bestow upon some gigantic mud flood the supreme honor of destroying this greatest kingdom that the world had ever allegedly seen. And I mean, look at us. So many conspirators and alternative timeline seekers and current timeline distrusters. I'm one of these people. We revel at the concept of a new way to explain some of the wonders from before that no longer seem to be popping up in modern times, right? The idea is that this great kingdom is from a timeline that they took from us and replaced with one of glass and steel and death and poverty and manipulation. And this mud flood effectively buried not only much of the evidence of the Grand Tartarian Empire in the United States, but it also buried our story with it. And for a long time, I believed this. I didn't really believe in the mud flood thing, but I believed that some of these buildings, these Greco-Roman buildings that the Tartarians are given credit for, I believe that some of them were kind of unexplainable in the United States, and that they may have been part of a past timeline. And you guys have heard me mention this if you've been to the show more than once. So kind of a new thing happened to me where now I have to redefine my existence. And honestly, I don't actually have to redefine my existence. I don't have to do any of this. I can just have faith and believe that everything's going to be fine, because it will be. But I'm not that kind of guy. I'm a questioner. So now I am digging back into the history of the United States a little bit more, and I found some really crazy stuff. The more that I dug, the less I believed in this Tartarian theory. And then I started to see that this was a relatively new conspiracy theory. We've been talking about Tartaria forever, but because it actually was a kingdom in the medieval ages and before. But the whole concept that they came over to the United States and built a bunch of these buildings and had really super high tech over here, and we are just sort of the imposter race that is now inhabiting their buildings. I'm starting to see why this conspiracy theory hasn't really been around that long, because not on the scale that it is today, because I just found more evidence to the contrary. So we're gonna go over it, but believe me, this is tough. I want to believe in elements of this theory, and there are many plot holes in our timelines, and without this, as I was saying, there's even more plot lines or plot holes in the timeline. So please disprove this video. I will gladly entertain all comments disagreeing. I'm not trying to be rude or disrespectful. I understand this is an important explanation for a lot of the things that are going on to a lot of people. A lot of people really subscribe to Tartarian. I'm not trying to take that away from you. I'm just giving you some additional information for why maybe I don't believe in it and why maybe we should be pursuing some other avenue. But I want you guys to engage in arguments with me and with each other, and let's try to keep it as peaceful as possible. And I want you guys to convince me I'm wrong. I kind of want to be wrong. But yeah, so, and then on Friday, we'll discuss some of these comments, and if any of them are super good, I'll make some follow-up videos and we'll discuss it, right? But for a while now, in my opinion, Tartaria has kind of been this catch-all answer for missing timelines and kingdoms, and especially in the United States. So let's give a little bit of a background visual of this place, this people. Tartaria was a blanket term, and some people called it Tartary back in the days. It was this blanket term used in Western European literature and cartography for basically this vast portion of Asia that was bound by the Caspian Sea, the Ural Mountains, the Pacific Ocean, and the northern borders of China, India, and Persia. And this was all at a time when the region was basically completely unknown to European geographers. So we were just talking about this area, calling it Tartary, but we really knew nothing about it. It was just this, well, there's this vast expanse of empty space over there, and we don't know what's going on in it, so let's just call it Tartary. And that's exactly what ended up happening. The active use of this place name can literally be traced from the 13th to the 19th centuries, and in European sources, Tartary became the most common name for just the Central Asia location in general that had no connection with the real policies or ethnic groups of the region. And until the 19th century, European knowledge of the area remained extremely scarce and fragmentary, perfect for a conspiracy theory to blossom from. And in modern English-speaking tradition, the region formerly known as Tartary is usually called now Inner or Central Eurasia. So much of this area consists of arid plains, and that's why most of the population there was engaged in animal husbandry. Coincidentally, this is also the same place that Genghis Khan was at. So ignorance surrounding Tartary's use as a place name, of course, has spawned many fantastic theories, including ideas of a hidden past in a mud flood, like we've been talking about. But by the 20th century, Tartary as a term for Siberia and Central Asia became totally obsolete. People weren't really thinking about this anymore, and it wasn't until about 10 years ago that we decided to start thinking about it again, because somebody with a YouTube account found the word Tartaria and decided to make it their entire personality, and now it's one of the most popular conspiracy theories on the market. And I understand, guys, for those who have seen my show before, you guys understand my dedication to the research and the origins of peoples being basically the origins of stories. And so if we're going to look for stories, we should look at the people. And that's true. If we're going to do a proper formal examination of the Tartarian Empire itself and the people, we would start with the origin story. But I'm not going to do that for this video because I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about their influence here in the USA, not them as a people. I know that the Tartarians existed. They existed over where in that geographical region that we've been talking about. That's where they live. There were Tartars, and they were defeated by, guess who? The Russians. So yes, we know that they were real, but we're talking about the United States. So were they over here, like these conspiracy theories are saying, with all of their high tech, building all of our Greco-Roman architecture and our tunnels and all that kind of stuff? That's what we're actually tackling today. Because I do believe that they may have done some crazy stuff over in Europe and you know, Eastern Asia and all that kind of stuff. Like, I do believe that they may have messed around and found out over there. But I'm just not sure they came to the United States anymore. And, you know, once the Tartars were defeated, that's kind of where everything begins to fade for me. Like, militarily, politically, and culturally, these Tartarians were defeated by the Russians. Most notably during the 16th and 17th centuries, as Moscow expanded and basically swallowed up all the remnants of the Golden Horde. And that, in historical terms, is kind of, to me, where the story begins to die. Because the empire falls, the people are absorbed, scattered, assimilated, or erased, and what happens? The victor writes the story. And so if the Russians didn't find it in them to preserve the history of these descendants of Mongol tribes, there's not going to be a whole lot of story. And if the Europeans don't care enough to go there and do archaeology and collect everything and dig for answers, then the story is just going to continue to be ambiguous, right? And we've seen examples under Trump, for instance, of names and pictures changing just because one man chose to make it that way. Look at the Gulf of America, for instance. So, and that's in a world where internet is popular and necessary. But in a world where internet didn't exist, names like Tartaria are just going to fade into ambiguity until somebody goes over there and does some archaeological research and actually pulls up a hovercraft or something that says that, yeah, the Tartarians were high tech. And that explains why so many maps have them as just this mysterious location over there, because we didn't know anything about them as Europeans. It wasn't taught to us, and we weren't really exploring that region of the world at that time. And one thing I want to clarify is that history is not always a lie. They're not always hiding history. Sometimes it just doesn't get told right. It doesn't get told at all, gets told wrong, gets mixed up, names get confused, places get confused, it gets rewritten by people who have never experienced the firsthand accounts that were written down in the first place. In my opinion, this is one of those cases. So no, nobody freak out. I mean, freak out, but don't freak out about this. It's not surprising that our Western education system hasn't taught us about this. I mean, they barely teach us about our own history these days. Why would they be teaching us about this ambiguous location over in Asia, right? Like, it doesn't, in Eastern Europe. It doesn't make any sense. We're too focused learning about our national history, our revolutions, our heroes, our fake histories. So that's why it's not exactly taught. It's not a thing that we learn about in our schools. Just like in South America, they don't really learn about the accomplishments of many of our World War II veterans. You know, they don't really know a lot about that. And I know that firsthand because I've probably spent more time in South America than all of you guys combined. And that's just the case. They don't really know much about our history. And in the same way, we don't really know much about their history or, you know, the histories of other parts of the world. It's really not that confusing of a concept. So when people talk about Tartaria as some grand forgotten civilization with secrets buried beneath the modern world, just know that some of that mystery is just simply due to our own disinterest and confusion about them. I will say though, if you want to have your mind blown, just go look at Russia, guys, because it looks exactly like what all of these people will tell you that this high-tech Tartaria looks like. It's funny how that works out, but if you want to see Tartarian architecture, just go look at Russia. Somehow they're able to continue with it. So I guess we still can build the same type of buildings, and I guess we still do have the same type of tech. I mean, have you seen Russia's new wartime basilica? It's insane. And it puts all these Tartarian buildings to shame. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that we could build these buildings. We still can build these buildings, and the Tartarians didn't have to build these buildings with some kind of high tech before us. And my example for that is Russia and a lot of the Eastern European and Asian domains. So, but as stated before, I don't think they came to the States. The conspiracy is based on almost entirely on this alternative view of architectural history in the USA. People suppose that demolished buildings such as the Singer Building, Penn Station, the World Fair buildings, they were all part of this vast empire that was based in Tartary that has been suppressed from our history. So yeah, the sumptuously styled Gilded Age buildings that we have here, the Great Pyramids, the White House, these are all Tartarian buildings, according to this conspiracy theory. And the conspiracy only vaguely describes how such a supposedly advanced civilization, which had reputedly achieved world peace, could have fallen and been hidden. And the traditional answer that I have resorted to is Nephilim. I believe that there were Nephilim in the United States. I still believe that, regardless of what you hear in this episode. But I don't think they built these buildings. And I don't think that the Nephilim are responsible for everything. So I don't know why we have to automatically go to, well, they built all our buildings too, because it's just like kind of like it doesn't make any sense. We know how the buildings were built. We have pictures of how the buildings were built. We have testaments from the people who built them. We know who built them, and yet we're still gonna be here and be like, I think it was the Nephilim. Why? You don't have to do that. And that's my whole point. And this is part of the problem with the Tartarian conspiracy theory is people are often just like, yeah, but how do you know? And it's like, because the history. And then they're like, yeah, but how do you know the history is real? And it's like, okay, well, how do you know 2 + 2 is 4? Is it just because traditionally you've been told that? Or have you actually like somehow done some kind of science to prove that those numbers are even valid and that those values even mean anything and that 2 + 2 as a concept actually does mean 4? You're just going to believe it, right? Because that's the way. And in the same way, I believe the millions upon millions of historical accounts from this time period completely eliminate the question, well, how do you know history's real? Because millions upon millions of people talked about it, and millions upon millions of people took photographs, wrote journals, had testaments, built buildings, left behind traces, are dead in graveyards, all this kind of stuff, guys. So like the history is here, and it is an embarrassment and an absolute insult to our ancestors and to ourselves in general to just say all history from pre-1812, which is generally considered when the Great Reset took place, that changed all of North America. We can't just say that everything that came before 1812 was fake because the Nephilim. Just because we want to. Right? We have proof. So we're looking at the proof and we're lining it up against the myth of Tartaria, and we're seeing that the proof is heavier. It weighs more than the Tartarian myth, and so that's why I take that. There's also this idea of the mud flood, right? Wiped out much of the world and old buildings with it, supported by the fact that many buildings across the world have architectural elements like doors, windows, and archways that are submerged many feet below the ground level. And this is for no apparent reason, according to the Tartarian conspiracists. World War I and II are cited as a way in which Tartaria was destroyed and hidden, reflecting the reality that the extensive bombing campaigns of World War II did destroy many historic buildings. And this is absolutely the case. We know this is the case. Wars are often used to destroy relics of the past, to destroy accounts from history, to destroy historical things that we don't want being seen anymore. This is true. And this is part of the Tartarian legend that I do believe in. I do believe there was a massive cover-up in the United States at this exact time. I do believe there was some kind of reset. I just don't believe the cities were here, and I don't believe the Tartarians were here before we were here. But I do believe in suppression of history through wartime campaigns, absolutely, and through non-wartime campaigns, and I think that's part of what was going on here. I think the Smithsonian was hiding giant bones in the mounds. I think there was all sorts of stuff that they were hiding here. This was the New World. All of the natives have stories of Nephilim and stuff like that, and monsters and cryptids. So yeah, I do believe that all of that was being hidden and suppressed. But I don't believe the Tartarian Empire, this high-tech unit of people who came here and built all of our cities, is what we should be digging for, because that's nonsense. The general evidence for the theory is that there are similar styles of these buildings all over the world that are being dug up or whatever. And we're talking about these Capitol buildings with domes, star forts, pillars, and columns, generally Greco-Roman or Eastern European style architecture. Also, many of the photographs from the turn of the 20th century do appear to show deserted streets in many capital cities across the world, and we will get to that. But when people do start to appear in the photographs, there is a striking contrast between the low-tech horse and cart dwellers in the muddy streets and the elaborate, highly ornate stone megastructures in the Greco-Roman fashion which tower above said inhabitants and cart dwellers. And this is another element of the conspiracy theory. How could we, with the tech we had at the time, have even built these structures? We're going to go over all of this. How and why could the youngest nation in the world at that time, the United States, display such monumental classical architecture so early and in such abundance. I mean, we're talking about they're rivaling Europe as far as the looks go, and they've only had their independence for like 75 years. We're talking about incredible construction projects completed at a time when officially we had just emerged from the Revolutionary War. We had just won our independence, and somehow, almost overnight, we're erecting these massive ornate buildings that begin appearing in photographs in the mid-1800s. You know what's ironic? That's when photography was invented. So yeah, that makes kind of sense that they begin to show up in photographs in the mid-1800s, because that's when photographs in general started showing up. But how were these buildings built? Because remember, we were told that there was nothing here before. Just Native Americans, teepees, mud huts. Remember that? I do. That's what I was taught. That's the dominant narrative that we were all taught. So that leaves us with kind of two possibilities, and we're going to go over both. One is that we built all these structures, us, the early Americans. And if that's the case, then yeah, we did it really, really quickly and with a limited population, and we have to explain that. Possibility two is that these monumental buildings already existed, and the indigenous people who were here before, the original inhabitants of this land, should then therefore have some kind of oral traditions or legends about them. If Tartarian style architecture was here before us, Native American groups would likely remember that, right? Well, this is where things get complicated, and this is exactly where the whole thing began to fall apart for me. We don't give Native Americans nearly enough credit when it comes to preserving historical memory. That's part of the colonizer mindset. Colonizers overwrite the past to legitimize the present. Conquerors do. Everybody who takes over a location, they write their own story about that location, regardless of the story that was here before a lot of the times. And it doesn't matter whether this is ancient Rome, Victorian Britain, or post-revolution America that we're talking about. The victor rewrites the story. And it's even easier to do that when the people that you're overwriting didn't rely on their own written language to preserve their history. And this is where the Tartarian people seem to believe something strange. And that's that effectively the Native Americans don't have any stories of this time because they didn't exist. And that I couldn't handle that answer. So I dug deeper and I was like, what do you mean the Native Americans didn't exist? And that's how you explain that they don't have any stories of these Tartarian style buildings in the old world. And that's pretty much where the explanation ends. No, yeah, they didn't exist. The same people that are conspiring over your timeline were also conspiring over the Native American timelines. And because of that, we basically think that all of the Native American tribes were actually transplanted here around the same time as the colonizers. So that's why they don't have any history of the Tartarians, because they were encountering their architecture at the same time as the white people. What? So basically, without any proof and without any sources, the only source being, let me check my research here, trust me, bro. It just says trust me, bro. We're just going to erase the histories of hundreds of distinct Native American tribes. And we don't even have an exact number of how many tribes there were. It kind of depends on how you define a tribe. But estimates generally range from 100 to several hundred tribes active at the time that all this was going on. And these groups spoke over 200 different languages and dialects. So we're just going to eliminate all of that because we have to somehow explain why the Native Americans don't have stories of Greco-Roman architecture in the USA. So to answer that question, what we're going to do is we're just going to eliminate the Native Americans. That sounds very colonial of you to assume that that could possibly be the answer. So you're just going to say all of those millions of people that were here thousands of years before us, none of their histories matter. None of them matter. As a matter of fact, they never existed. They're fake. I totally disrespect you if you have that opinion. That is just absolutely diabolical. But according to the Tartarian conspiracy theory, that's the case. Seems pretty racist to me. And yeah, you're colonizing a historical landscape with your own conspiracy theory, just like you're accusing the great conspirators and the architects of the Tartarian conspiracy theory of doing with your own historical timeline. You're just doing it to another race of people that you have just completely failed to research at all. It's counterintuitive, leads us to nowhere. And it is the thing that began to convince me that maybe this whole conspiracy theory is literally a wild goose chase, that none of it matters. Because the idea is that literally everything before the War of 1812 is just made up for the internet age of NPCs and TikTokers to mull about over. And they already don't care about their own history, so why would they care about this other history? You could tell them the truth and they wouldn't even care. So there you go. And by the way, the Menominee tribe that lives about an hour away from me, who I'm doing a movie with in the very near future, they claim to have lived in this region of Wisconsin for over 10,000 years. We have thousands of acres of their farmland that they have used for thousands of years being studied right now, and there were so many Menominee people here that it's actually rewriting the concept of how people farmed across the whole planet in this time and in this era. The stuff that we're finding is absolutely diabolical. So for the Tartarian people to come here with their 10-year-old conspiracy theory and say, no, none of that happened, you're not gonna get me with that, guys. And the thing that's really, really funny is we do have old world buildings here. You know, the White House, a lot of the Capitol buildings, a lot of the buildings in the older cities in our cities here, especially the bigger ones, are considered old world buildings. We've got them everywhere. But the old world people that were actually here, the Native Americans, they don't consider those buildings that old. Matter of fact, less than a couple hundred years old. You guys know how heavily I rely on all the Native American and indigenous stories when I'm examining the histories of ancient locations, because who better to ask than the people who are actually there? So no thanks, Smithsonian. So yeah, essentially this is the first chink in the armor that I couldn't really explain away. I couldn't figure out why we would prioritize a made-up influence from an old Eastern world civilization on the other side of the planet before we would prioritize the accounts of the actual old world people who lived here. The ones who do also have stories of Nephilim, but don't have any stories of those Nephilim building great buildings. They have stories of those Nephilim living in caves. So the answer simply being because it was this way is why it is this way isn't good enough for me. You gotta have facts, and you gotta have something to point to that actually even remotely resembles the point that you're trying to make. Sometimes choosing the obvious answer is okay, especially when the answer is obvious. Have faith that not everything is a conspiracy. Sometimes mud floods do happen, though. Landslides and stuff, it's true. They've happened all over the place. But an entire planet? An entire country? Even hundreds or thousands of square miles of land within a country? You've got to have some evidence, guys. Not just, well, the lower story on a bunch of these buildings is under the ground. That doesn't mean that there was a global cataclysm. We have evidence of actual global cataclysms, like the flood. So why wouldn't we have evidence of one that occurred somewhere around 200 years ago or whatever? That makes no sense, guys. Even if it happened thousands of years ago, by the way, still applies. You gotta have evidence. Simply screaming, the church did this, the Smithsonian did this, the Freemasons did this. It's not enough of an answer in this particular case for me to upend the hundreds of years of geological surveys and construction project records. It's just not enough to totally uproot the thousands of years of Native American stories. And yet, this mud flood explanation remains a critical sort of obelisk in the proverbial landscape of this conspiracy theory. In cities like Chicago and St. Petersburg and all sorts of others all over the world, people dismiss windows that are half buried beneath contemporary pavement because they kind of are evidence that the city has changed, not necessarily that there was a global cataclysmic mud flood. What actually most likely happened when you're seeing cities with buildings, some of which, not all of which, notice, just some of them, when they have portions that are underground, it's because the city had to be rebuilt because that building is old and it was built from a time when the ground was lower They have to harden the ground as the city expands. They have to regrade. And a lot of times that meant your basement was expanding because we're trying to build a city here and your one building that's already slouching because you didn't build it properly is not going to be the building that somehow changes where we put our city. We're going to regrade this plot of land. You're going to have a bigger basement and we're going to build on the new level of ground. That is common everywhere. Everywhere that you build a building, that happens. So finding these buildings with partially buried portions, stories, levels, whatever you want to say, that's not evidence of some grand mud flood, some global cataclysm. Are you kidding me? If there was a global cataclysm, wouldn't have taken out much more than just the lower levels of some buildings? But when you line it up with some of the other stuff that's going on, like this war that I've termed the Great Arson War, I've talked about it before. I'm not going to discredit or attempt to disprove that there was something here worth hiding, because those fires are proof of that to me as well. You know, the great fires of Chicago, San Francisco, St. Louis, all these fires that were popping up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, burning down entire cities, all that kind of stuff. I do think there was a knowledge suppression there. I do. But Tartaria is a convenient decoy, in my opinion. I think there was something else being hidden. So I want to make very clear that I'm not saying that all of this tragedy that was going on in the United States with the fires and the wars and the destruction and the digging up of the mounds, I'm not saying that any of that is fake. I'm saying that it's not for Tartaria. It's for another reason, which is probably to find the Nephilim and the remnants of the Nephilim that were here, because they were everywhere. So I'm not going to cover all these fires or dive too deeply into every peculiar detail surrounding them. But yeah, there's a bunch of strange stories from these fires, especially regarding like spontaneous combustion, people's stuff, just that when they're nowhere near the fire seeming to explode or combust into flames. Sometimes people themselves just starting on fire when they're nowhere near the fires. They're watching the fire from a distance, and we have stories of people's clothes starting on fire, almost like there was like an energy weapon directed in the location. I do believe in that kind of stuff. I believe in melted rock and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to Tartaria, that is a forced piece of this puzzle. That is a square in the round hole. It doesn't fit. We should be looking for the right answer, not that one. But despite all of these fires, and this is really important, some of these buildings still remain today. These structures have become our grand capital and government buildings, and they're characterized by their imposing marble works and their granite pillars, their classical Greco-Roman architectural styles. They're absolutely beautiful. Go to Washington, D.C., and you'll see some of the best ones in our country. You know, it all echoes of the architecture that was prevalent during the Greek and Roman architectural genesis. The whole time frame from the ancients that we've sort of continued to adopt and build our culture and our empires around. And we see empires all over the world following in Greco-Roman footsteps. This very architectural continuity, is precisely what fuels the entire Tartarian conspiracy, though. And it seems like if there's an architectural trend, a pattern, it's not exactly surprising that everybody did it, especially when a lot of architects go all over the world. It's not like they just architect one building and then that's it. But it doesn't seem to ever occur to these Tartarian people that most of the people who built these buildings in the United States were Europeans. The master builders, the designers, the architects, and a lot of the laborers were Europeans. Europe literally determined the style and culture of architecture in the United States because they were all from Europe or directly related to somebody from Europe. This was 75 years after we got our independence, guys. We weren't even 100 years old yet. We were fighting tons of wars with the actual old world peoples here, the indigenous, that were actually trying to get us out of here, and they were also gearing up for a civil war at the time. Like, we didn't have time to invent new architectural styles or establish building lines or fashion lines for how we do things. All that stuff came from Europe. This is an easy concept to understand. We were Europeans, we brought European ways with us. A lot of the examples of old world buildings that the Tartarian clan likes to utilize simply show architecture with European characteristics. Boom, domes, spires, big blocks, statues. All things that if you've ever gone out of the country, you will see everywhere else in the world, but especially Europe. And that's the problem. We were a young country. We didn't have any of our own way of doing things yet. We had all of Europe's ways of doing things. It's confusing to explain why we have so much European architecture here and culture here if we don't understand that it's because we were Europeans. Things become even more complicated when we start examining the photographs and we see examples from, architecture in buildings that aren't there anymore. St. Louis doesn't look the same as it did back then. It looked a little more grand back then. So did Seattle and San Francisco, New York. They all had buildings that are no longer there, right? And a lot of these pictures reveal cities that would appear to not even exist today because of that very reason. And these buildings seem way too grand to have not stood the test of time. So we're going to say that because buildings were torn down, we're suppressing history? We're suppressing the history of some high-tech Tartarian empire because buildings that were no longer needed were torn down? That's kind of the American way. That's what we do. We tear stuff down and then we build on top of it. The buildings in these pictures, I'll admit, they are far grander. They're dramatically massive compared to the humble shanties and shops that surround them typically. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't build those buildings. Consider Chicago in 1893, for instance, which featured a remarkable section of the city nicknamed the White City, and this is what became known as the Chicago World Fair. It was very clean and very elaborate. 200 neoclassical palaces were built there. We had archways. We even had a Ferris wheel that was taller than London's Big Ben, which was erected, all of it, in only 26 months. All for a convention. Even this year, Donald Trump was talking about how he wanted to have another great American World Fair here, and it was going to be a 6-month party. And they're going to build concessions, and they're going to build buildings, and people are going to come from all over the world, and they're going to be able to showcase their relationship with the United States and the great achievements that they've achieved and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be this big thing. It's going to last a while, but not forever. Same thing. It's a convention. It's not permanent. So yeah, that's precisely what happened with the World Fairs. That, again, not hard to explain. They were temporary events specifically designed to boost national morale and to invite the world to witness the grandeur and capability of the United States and to showcase their own accomplishments. Because we invited these other nations. What would happen at these world fairs is basically we would have buildings representing other countries. So like Denmark would have a building, and China or Japan would have a building, or whoever was invited, whatever nations were invited, they would have their own building at the World Fair. That's why were so many of them. A lot of the states had their own buildings as well in a similar fashion. But the thing is, those other countries that had buildings here brought their own resources and laborers to build those buildings. And that's something that if you just research the history, you will see. But these Tartarian people don't research. They just look at Wikipedia, they find a weird answer, and they mold it into their little explanation for a gigantic Tartarian high-tech empire. They don't understand that the Irish and every other country were coming over with boats filled with stuff to build buildings for the world fairs. And at the same time, the Americans were building their own buildings for the world fairs. So yeah, there were a lot of people working on this. So 26 months with many nations assisting doesn't really sound that unexplainable or mysterious to me. Sounds like the whole world came together to help build these fairs. And that's kind of the answer right there. These were temporary events specifically designed to have fun and showcase the wonders of the world in America, a new country of promise. That's it. But the questions linger, right? Like, how could such grand buildings have been erected so quickly, they say? Where did all the materials come from? And sure, maybe those guys built those, but who built the rest of them? Especially the more permanent ones that are still here. But it becomes easy to see what's going on when you come to the realization that, once again, the truth provided makes way more sense than the conspiracy theory. It's not to say there isn't a different conspiracy theory besides high-tech Tartarians building our entire empire, but it is to say that that one makes no sense. The truth is these buildings were very cheaply built in the World Fairs, and a lot of buildings that came after the World Fairs were built in the same cheap fashion. Not all of them, and the ones that we liked the most that we built in temporary fashion, we then recased in stone and made them more permanent. That's just the way it was done. But most of these buildings, the Tartarian people will say there's no possible way that they could be temporary. There's no possible way that these buildings went up in 26 months only to come down 6 months or only a year later when they're built of marble and stone and concrete and all these grand carvings are on there. Not only could those buildings not have been put up in such a short amount of time only to be taken down, but they also could not have possibly been built by us because we didn't even have that kind of technology. That's what they'll say. Why? I no longer have any clue. Because every single structure was primarily built with wood and then sheathed in a temporary material called staff. This is fact. And this is a compound made from hemp and plaster and horsehair, and sometimes even other substances depending on the location and the builder. And it came from, you guessed it, Europe, bro. And just like STDs in the city of Denver, once that stuff got here, it spread everywhere. It was a wonder compound, guys. It was like peanut butter. It was this incredible new material. So let's get into how wonderful it really was, because again, this is arguably the most important argument that Tartarian conspiracists utilize, that it wasn't possible for us to build these buildings. So let's take a look. If they're going to say the buildings weren't temporary and that we couldn't build them, well, naturally, I'm just going to deep dive into that, because I know that there's documents and pictures out there from this time showing exactly how they built these temporary buildings, and I've got them here for you to see as well. So here we go. Here is a literal newspaper article describing the use of staff. They say, and you'll see here in a second, that it's so easy a child could do it. What? These buildings were so easy to build that children could do it? Oh yeah, wait, child labor was legal back then? Oh, wait, we had an abundance of orphans too because so many people were dying? Wait, what? Wait, no, child labor couldn't possibly be something that actually contributed to the construction of these buildings, could it? I don't know. Let's read the article and see. Staff. The new compound used on the World Fair's buildings. Looking at the fair from this island will be seen as from no other point in the entire layout to what exquisite uses the compound called staff may be put. This material, which seems to be a revelation to the American public, has two qualities that render it preeminently fit for just such work as it is here devoted to. First, it makes the wood around which it is placed as an exterior perfectly fireproof from any ordinary conflagration. Second, it is susceptible of the highest artistic decoration and plastic decoration. When the buildings of the exposition are finished, they will present an aggregate of marble palaces, colored and tinted to realize the ideals of the most artistic fancy, nay, extravagance in color. The manufacture, modeling, and application of the staff at the Chicago Fair are done by 3 firms. The mere manufacture of the material does not require any special technical knowledge. Mere laborers can do all the work. But it is a fact that the laborers who work in the staff rooms at the World's Fair are Belgians, French, and Italians. So they're immigrants. They're not even Americans, guys. These people are coming over to help us with this. One might as well be in Flanders or Paris as in one of these rooms, so far as surroundings are concerned. The small boy... What? Wait, the small boy? Well, you don't use the word small boy to describe a full-grown man, do you? Well, the Tartarian people might think you do, but this article doesn't seem to think so. It says the small boy cuts a conspicuous figure herein. He is active, useful, cheap, accurate, and an effective worker. He is a type of the staff maker. So are these two boys near a small chopping block. One is sitting on a roll of hemp that is twisted into 1-inch rope. He places one end of the rope loosely on the block. His companion, armed with a severely sharp little axe, brings that tool down swiftly on the rope's end with marvelous accuracy, cutting it off cleanly and with dispatch, and shoves it into a basket that stands ready to receive it. When the basket is nearly full, another boy carries it away, and the cut hemp is teased into a loose pile. It is now ready for the mixer, who scatters the right proportion of it in his half barrel of common cement, mixed with a small percentage of plaster of Paris. He agitates the mass until the mixing becomes difficult to the hand, and there's an end to it. The staff is made. The cement contributes hardness to the compound, the hemp adhesiveness, and the plaster of Paris finish, and it is then pressed into slabs, which are nailed to the wooden walls of the building, or turned over to the modelers and sculptors who work it into mural decorations. Guys, there it is. They just described how not only were these buildings temporary at the World's Fair, and this is how it was built or made before it was then attached to wood, but it was also done by children. What? These buildings were so easy to build that children could do it? Children helped. This is a concept that modern people cannot understand in the West. Child labor was real. And because you guys want a conspiracy theory does not mean that you can just brush over the ugly history. Here's another one. The staff modeler's work is of a low order of sculpture, but the results are sometimes really artistic. They are assisted by original models or drawings, and in this combination are enabled to make bas reliefs and friezes that will contribute in no small way to the beauty of the buildings. The results of this work will not end with the World's Fair, it is thought. There is no reason why the effects should not extend further, and in some degree cause a change in building methods. So this stuff is so effective, so dope, that we're going to continue to use it even after the World Fairs. So we see that we're going to build more buildings in this kind of temporary but wondrous fashion. Here's some guys who are using it in modern times. Plasterwork, aka staff. Material obtained by thin molding of a specific plaster, armed with fibers, with canvas or wire mesh, prefabricated by elements. The work in staff is built by assembly and juxtaposition of these elements, fixed to the support, sealed between them, and specially merged to form continuous surfaces. The professional name of this particular know-how is staff. And look at this guy. He's just got a regular chisel, just a chisel. And look at this amazingly detailed stuff that he's over here making with just his chisel. Look, here's some other plasterwork applications. All these buildings, how did we possibly build all of these buildings? We attended during the last decade to a large use of the staff and exemplary applications in the cultural domain, quite particularly in prestigious buildings, created, restored, or rearranged with the aim of a new appropriation within the framework of the Grands Travaux, which is the name of a huge French cultural project, meaning literally the big works. Guys, this to me is the smoking gun, but of course it's not to the Tartarians because they don't believe this. I literally have watched their videos and heard them make fun of this concept. They say that all these buildings were just made out of plaster. Well, it's not that simple. The plaster was pretty solid plaster and even temporarily fireproof as long as the fire wasn't ridiculous, which later they became ridiculous, so ridiculous that we couldn't even put the fires out with water because it would evaporate, because that's how hot these buildings would burn once they started going. And that is why so many of these buildings no longer exist, because not only did we tear them down for parts and we didn't need them in the exposition, but also, yeah, they were actually just destroyable. As a matter of fact, there's accounts of people accidentally leaning on the walls of these World Fair buildings and their hands going through the walls because it's just plaster. So yeah, guys, there are explanations for how they built these temporary buildings, and you have just seen them. Look, here are some examples of all the things that were built in this fashion. Look at all of these buildings. Look at this. Boom. Made with staff. Here's the guy. Look at this. Look at this. But we're going to say, no way, dude. This photo is not real. No way. All these things made with staff. Here's more. These are some of the sculptures that were at the World's Fair in Chicago. How is it possible? How did we possibly do this? There's no way we were this technologically advanced. Bro, why were we just morons to you guys? Like 150, 175 years ago? Were we just totally idiots 200 years ago to you guys? Like, we were one day a collection of colonies and the next day a world power. So what makes you think we wouldn't have the ability to do this kind of stuff? I don't understand the logic, especially when the proof is provided for how they did it and it's a continued craft to this day, and yet the Tartarian people are like, nope, that's not possible. That's a lie. See, that's where they get you. They made up the history. Oh, so now staff doesn't even exist? Even though, is that website a lie? Those people who just really care about sculpture talking about staff, are they BSing me? Oh, man. See, this is what happened. Once I started looking, it was just falling apart before my very eyes. But within less than a decade, much of these staff buildings would be completely gone. They would all have been burned down, dismantled, or dynamite. St. Louis, though, did replicate this approach in 1904, but they tore down most of the buildings almost immediately after the closing day tickets were counted. It was never meant to last. The official explanation given was that staff simply couldn't withstand a lot of the harsh Midwestern winters. So builders didn't actually have to use actual granite and concrete and marble and stuff like that because staff offered a nearly identical appearance at a fraction of the cost and labor. It was extremely lightweight and intentionally temporary, but because of that, it's not going to last the winters. So we're going to have to encase the ones we want to keep in actual stone. And those are the ones that you still see today, guys. That's it, man. But people who believe in the existence of Tartaria in the USA argue that these structures weren't actually temporary, despite all of that. Looking over thousands of these photos, a lot of this work doesn't look as mathematically perfect and flawless as they say, too. You can see, if you look close at these pictures, because obviously you're not going to see the damages and the rough-hewn edges and the dents in the sheet metal and the miscuts in all of the staff. You're not going to see all of that stuff from miles away where the photography is taken, because that's landscape photography. Do you see the bugs on the bark on the trees when you take a picture of a forest from a mile away? No, bro. Common sense. Use it. But some Tartarian believers go so far as to say that angels or giants built these buildings instead of us. Just showed you guys the process. And I'm not saying that those entities weren't here in the United States. I'm not saying that they weren't here at this time, even. I'm just saying they didn't do this. Like, maybe those entities did build the original Greco-Roman structures from Greece and Rome and did go all over the world as kingdoms and empires were rising, because that's what Watchers do and Nephilim do and Bloodlines do. Indeed, America does possess some genuinely incredible examples of this type of architecture. A lot of them are masterpieces, but certainly not all of them, and certainly not the ones that I've been showing you guys today, which are the buildings that are primarily used by these Tartarian empirists. Here's a video from an actual dude who builds skyscrapers telling you how possible all of this is. And this is a boring video that I watched because that's what actual research is. You don't just go to Wikipedia and find, well, I don't know. It says how they did it, but I still don't even believe that. So what they're actually probably saying is that it's not possible. Well, this dude, who is an expert and has nothing to gain by lying to you and has the knowledge of construction that none of us have. He's sitting here describing it in terms that I understand and that makes sense. So I'm not going to make you guys watch this whole video. I just want you to know that it's out there, and that if you're going to do research on a conspiracy theory, go beyond Wikipedia. Do actual research. One common claim made by proponents of the Tartarian idea is the mysterious lack of blueprints for some reason. Because what happens is, if they're like, well, if you can explain that, then how do you explain this? And if you can explain that, then how do you explain this? And finally, after explaining countless things to the Tartarian people, you get to the question of blueprints. Where are all the blueprints? I don't know, dude. Maybe they're just not online. Maybe they're in a box at the back of the basement down there that was buried when they regraded the streets. Maybe it was lost in a fire. I don't know where the blueprints are. Why does that prove that these buildings were millions of years old or something like that, buried in a mud flood? How does that prove anything? And then another question that they'll always ask is, well, and if you guys want, you can go back and you can watch that video of the guy explaining how buildings are built, specifically in this time period, and you guys can get a way better explanation than me. But basically, the long story short is, when you see buildings built on top of other buildings, that doesn't mean there's a conspiracy theory. Cities are always built on top of old cities. They always have been. When we establish a city, we're going to keep building on that city. We're not just going to move that city when the buildings become outdated, when they fall down, because it's convenient that there is a layer of foundation and stonework and brick and pressed dirt down there. So it doesn't make sense to just eliminate the landscape and move somewhere else and then build there. It makes sense to demolish and then rebuild. And that's the way that it has always been. That's just how civilization works, especially if you can throw up a building in a matter of months. When a building gets old, damaged, or inconvenient, you don't pack up the whole town and move it. You tear down the building, you level it, you build something else on top, you regrade the landscape, and you keep on going. The layers of human habitation stack like sediment, guys. And nowhere is that more obvious or more aggressively executed than in the US. We build on top of our stuff all the time. It's practically a national tradition. This is practically our architectural traditional way. We don't preserve, we demolish, and we have always done that. We don't honor the old, we repave it. We don't question why certain structures feel like they belong to a different time. We bulldoze them, we gentrify them, and we build something cheaper, uglier, more lifeless. It's not because we can't build those other buildings. It's because we need something that's cheaper and turns a big profit. That's what it became. And that is possibly one of the biggest things to understand, is that mentality amongst society changed. We became a profit-engineered system versus one that wanted freedom and rights and glory and honor, and to show that we could build the same stuff as everybody else, and we fought off the world powers. But gradually over time, our desire for supreme beauty and respect and admiration based on aesthetics changed, and we evolved into a culture that's based on profit. It's about control, guys. Property values, rebranding, sometimes literally just converting physically and metaphorically to something that works better. Just because these buildings are beautiful doesn't mean they fit a purpose that whoever has them needs. But we act like that's abnormal somehow, when in actuality it's just part of the American architectural story. We do it proudly. And a lot of people say that's what makes America great. We're constantly evolving and expanding and changing. You could also argue that that's what makes America forget, because now we're talking about Tartaria instead of our own abilities as a great nation back in the 1800s. These builders, these engineers, these architects, these construction projects, they were a lot more intelligent and intuitive than we're giving our ancestors credit for. I don't know why we think they were all cave people back then who didn't know how to build stuff. We were on that crack, boy. And I don't think that it's an insult to anybody to say that we were balling, and we were doing so with no budget. We were producing so much materials because we didn't have any conservation acts. We were just out here cutting stuff down, mining stuff up, and throwing buildings up. That's where all the materials came from. That's how it happened. Like, I don't feel like I need to go into much more explanation than that. And don't even get me started on the question, how could they build these things without electronics or power tools? That's one of those questions that's only valid until it's answered. And it is answered and has been for a very, very long time. These guys didn't need those things. Just because now we are a society that is reliant on electricity and plugging in does not mean that the ancients were. And it's kind of weird that you assume that our ancestors weren't plugged in, but their ancestors were plugged in. Like, sometimes you can see evidence of that around the world, but not here. And that's the argument. Not really here do you see evidence of electric tools being used. So why is that part of the argument? We continually try to fit this into the narrative, but we should also remember that Nikola Tesla was literally trying to solve this problem at the exact same time that all this is happening. So clearly we're trying to get into the electrical world, but that doesn't mean that we, far back in the past, the Tartarians or whoever they were, it doesn't mean they had the tools and now we don't, just because we don't have it now. Like, why would I believe that? There's literally no reason for me to, except pure conjecture being spit in my direction that may somehow manipulate me if you say it enough times. I might, like, concoct an idea in my head, but I'm not gonna waste all my time thinking about that, because it's like imagining something that's fake. It's like, just, well, what if everybody had 4 hands and that's how everything got built so much faster? But that's what the Tartarian people will believe too, because they also believe that people weren't eating food in these days. They believe that there were, like, vibrations that caused people to not have to take dumps, and that's why there wasn't an emphasis on plumbing in the 1800s. So now you're going to say these people had power tools and they didn't have to eat. They didn't even have to go to the bathroom. What the heck are you guys talking about? Like seriously, like, this is some NPC conspiracy theory. Like, you guys are just making stuff up. And when I say you guys, I mean the Tartarian people who refuse to let this go despite the proof. Because, like, look at it. You guys have to make weird stuff up, like people didn't eat, people didn't go to the bathroom, and they had technology that we never had. And sometimes I think some of those things are accurate at some parts of the world. But when you have actual construction photos and sometimes even videos of people building these buildings, why do you have to invent those 3 things to prove to you your conspiracy theory? You concocted a situation, a fantasy world. But that's precisely the problem, because this whole conspiracy is a popular trend on channels like Mind Unveiled and My Lunch Break, which I do love, by the way. Lore Lodge and John Levi, all these shows thrive on this topic, though. But as I continued to look at this, I saw that they were all just saying the same thing, showing the same pictures, they have the same arguments, they're making the same points, and a lot of times the same visual styles as well. It's an echo chamber, and they're all in it, feeding each other and feeding everybody else, and it does make me wonder if they're grifters, because I just don't, it's the same recipe every single time on repeat. Same music, same aesthetic, same pictures, same voices, same topics. Sometimes it sounds like they're saying the same exact sentences, and I'm pretty sure they just go to each other for research, and then they regurgitate each other's videos, because they get millions of views. Like, this to me seems like a rabbit hole to nowhere. So I'm here to shake the paradigm up a little bit. You guys know that that's the way I be. But look, my goal isn't to debunk a conspiracy theory or ridicule alternative historical timelines that actually have valid basis behind them. But until then, I'm just not going to accept it anymore. And I hope that you guys do jump in here, like I said before, and you disprove me. I'm okay with being disproven. One of the arguments that the Tartarian people have that I actually do find very fascinating is the argument of population. People who have been listening to me for a little while know that I've got a degree in sociology, so I take the study of society extremely serious because I think it's incredibly important to understand how people function as a group. Believe it or not, I think sociology is a great study to go hand in hand with conspiracy theories and cryptids and mysteries and all that kind of stuff. It helps you understand how people do things, how people react to things, how people process issues and problems, how people overcome, how they perform. That being said, that taken at face value and with almost zero research, when you dig into the numbers of population and all that kind of stuff, the math doesn't seem to add up when you stack it against these massive buildings all over the country and how cities were going up so fast and all that kind of stuff. You're left with a little bit of an obstacle here, but it's not that hard to understand if you just do a small amount of research. A small amount of research that isn't on Wikipedia. The 1850 United States Census, when all this stuff was really kicking off, and this was the 7th official census, recorded a population in the United States of just over 23 million. And that was a 35% increase from 1840. So yeah, the population's growing fast. But even so, we are talking about a young country here, 75-ish years old, just a few generations removed from its revolution. And it's already pulling off these massive architectural projects. How is that possible? It's rivaling Europe. So of that 23 million people, I went deeper into the research, just under 12 million were male. There were actually more females here than male. And when you dive even deeper, most of that male population over 15, keyword over 15, because people under 15 weren't counted, but over half of those 12 million males over 15 were actively engaged in some type of work. But like a solid work, like a trade that they did. That's what they did. About 60% of that was agricultural. So that means around 13.8 million people, the majority, were farming. They were working the land. They were feeding the country. Now pause and consider that. 14 million Americans were farming in 1850. Then who was left to build the ornate, towering structures that we see stamped with founding dates like 1836 and 1849, all that kind of stuff? Well, if you take that remaining 9 million people who were not in agriculture and you divide that down the middle, you got roughly 4.5 million men. But that's not where the problem stops. That's not the amount of laborers, because how many of those people were doctors, factory workers, business owners, inventors, soldiers, teachers, politicians, like all scientists, all of these jobs, right? Because 4.5 million men, but a lot of men still have these jobs. And those numbers, that's where it starts to get gray. I doubt the bakers and the blacksmiths were out here building. They were probably baking and blacksmithing, right? So there's no way to really know exactly how many American citizens were building these buildings, but it was probably less than 4 million. And it was probably less than 2 million. Because those are the men, allegedly, who were left over to construct hundreds, maybe thousands of monumental buildings. And we're meant to believe that this all happened within a few decades, with only like maybe 2 million men to do it. Doesn't really make sense. But there's a couple things that we're not considering even now. And that's that during that time, between 1861 and 1945, we lost men by the hundreds of thousands. And considering all the other conflicts going on at the time with the Native Americans, we're looking at over 1 million lives lost just during this time frame in general, because during this time period, a man could literally survive the Civil War, World War I, and World War II and still be under 80 years old. One guy can experience all three. So that's a lot of lives being lost as we're fighting and overcoming these wars. But then also during this time, you have things like the Great Depression, you have all the fires. So there's a lot of damage and destruction going on during this time. There's a lot of death. The Tartarian researchers point this out as being called the triple cull catastrophe. And that's where the physical evidence was destroyed in the Great Fires, eyewitnesses were eliminated by time and war, and generational memory was wiped out by attrition purely because there weren't enough fathers to pass down stories. There weren't enough men to remind people of their history constantly. And so a lot of people forgot parts of the past. I believe this is part of a great reset. I don't believe it has anything to do with Tartaria, but I believe it was a great reset of some type. I do believe in the triple cull, just not in the context of this conspiracy theory. So how is it possible? We did not have enough people. You are 100% correct if you believe that. But you're forgetting something. Remember all those people under the age of 15 that weren't counted? child slavery was legal in the United States, and child labor was even more widespread. You could pay little kids pennies on the dollar to do manual labor, and they would do it. That's a huge difference in just societal expectations of every member compared to today. So like we've got like who knows how many kids assisting in the labor of this, not to mention the orphans. Oh, wait a second. In these years, we had 4 million black people as slaves in the United States. But we also had something we don't talk about. Over 5 million Native American slaves in the United States during this time. There's your superpower. There's your manpower. We had 10 million slaves. And we employed our children and any man that would be willing to work. And we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it, despite the fact that everybody is constantly obsessed with slavery in this country. For some reason, in this conspiracy theory, it just doesn't apply. Let me guess, the slaves didn't exist either? Like, how are you going to eliminate that smoking gun? You had a liberal labor force that would be killed if they didn't labor. That's how. Right there. Many of these other so-called old world buildings that are still standing today that weren't temporary were built by the slaves and with slave and orphan labor, and this is heavily documented. You cannot escape it unless, yes, you just believe that all history is fake, nothing is real, not even the accounts of people who are actually there. They're making it up because they're all in on it, and that just really makes you look like you think you're being gang stalked. You want to know a couple of the projects that were built during this time by the slaves? The White House, the Capitol building, Harvard, even the Monument of Freedom, and hundreds of other buildings built by the slaves. This is documented. But Western pride pulls us into this state of mind where we allow ourselves to just forget uncomfortable details about our own history. But every country does this. I'm not one of those people who's like, we need to talk about racism more. Absolutely the heck not. I'm not one of those people. But you can't just forget that this happened. We don't recognize the time and experiences and history and life that is lived by millions of people between two landmark periods of time. The buildings were not here one day, and boom, now they're here. What happened? Well, it didn't happen in 1 second. It wasn't a snap of the finger and now the building's up. There's time that existed between these moments. If you've got 1,000 people building a building 14 hours a day on slave labor, I'm pretty sure it's gonna go up dang fast. But these people don't research the time period. They don't understand that Jesse James was out here staging train heists at the same time that all this is going on, and at the same time as that, Nikola Tesla is tuning lightning in Colorado Springs so that he can floodlight the Chicago World's Fairgrounds with AC current. This isn't a coincidence of dates. This is an actual collision of realities. These things were happening at the same time. Helena Blavatsky was out here talking about Atlantis and ancient wisdom at the same time that Jules Verne was writing Journey to the Center of the Earth, and at the same time, we got Wyatt Earp out here breaking up saloon fights. These are all happening at the same time, but of course Hollywood doesn't paint that picture. Of course Hollywood doesn't. Hollywood destroys the timelines. We're told the Wild West is one century and electricity and philosophy and mysticism and all that kind of stuff is in the next century. We paint the picture of the reality that we want people to see. And you could say, well, see, you just said it. See, they painted the reality that the slaves built these buildings. And it's okay for you to say that, but not without some kind of proof. Not without some kind. Because otherwise you could just say, well, it was the reptilians who did it. Or else you could say it was the Martians. Or else you could say, well, it was the Aztecs. They built them. Or it was the Canadians. So, if you do believe that slavery actually happened, I can't believe I'm actually saying that. If that actually happened, then you have a labor force the size of all men in the United States at this time, dedicated just to labor. That's how buildings went up so fast. That's why a lot of them built and fell down. That's why a lot of them didn't last. But it wasn't just slaves, guys. You know how they say, like, if you build it, they will come? The USA was kind of the opposite of that. The USA was more like, they will come and they will build it. Because that's also what happened when it came to immigration. We had almost completely open immigration policies at this point, and especially for laborers. Our population, like we said before, almost doubled in 10 years because of this. This was the place to be. We even had nicknames for these immigrants that would come over just to build, and then they would go back to their own countries again. But these birds of passage, as they're called, they would literally come over to America, work for $1.25 a day, building constantly. When that project was done in Seattle, they'd go to St. Louis and they'd build buildings there. When that's done, they'd go to New York and they'd build buildings there. And once they saved enough money, they'd go back to Ireland or France or Italy or wherever they came from. And that was just it. Completely unaccounted for. And there were millions of those people. So you have immigrants coming over and also building everything, but not staying, not sticking around. But a lot of them did stay too. You can see how this contributes to the amount of people who are building. And no, these people are not documented. They're not on the census because we only used them for labor. And if they stayed, they became part of that gradual increase that we see on the censuses. Countless immigrants, millions of slaves, all just looking to be used as cheap or free labor. And the labor, if you remember, was awesome because it required almost no skills. Remember, so easy a child could do it. We get to go a little step further because a lot of people are saying, well, like, okay, even if we have the slaves who took like the brunt of the construction, how did we move everything? Just like they ask about all the ancient megaliths from the past. How do we move everything with just horses and carts? Well, the same way that all those people did it, you know. Besides the ones who obviously had forbidden technology, this is not an example of forbidden technology here. We didn't need it because we had a different kind of technology known as the horse. We had so many horses that we tossed them around like a means to an end. Remember, this is before animal rights. This is before OSHA. This is before conservation. We are rapidly deforesting, we're rapidly mining, and we're rapidly killing animals so that we can throw up these structures. And there's very few codes, very few restrictions, very few regulations. In this case, the landscape that was between two landmark events, buildings being not there and buildings being there, is littered with dead horses and horse crap. You guys ever wondered why everything is referred to in horsepower? Yeah, dude, it's because horses defined power. Horses were so widely and heavily used at this time, and that's just a reality that everybody seems to forget, by the way, but they were so widely and heavily used that we didn't even think about it when a horse died. A hard-worked horse back then only lasted 4-ish years, maybe 5. I mean, you've got the cobblestones they're walking on constantly, destroying their feet and legs. You've got the overloading, the underfeeding, the underhydration, not to mention the pollution, lungfuls of coal dust. New York itself kept somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 horses in continuous circulation. And they pulled streetcars and drays and construction wagons. They did everything. But a single brutal summer could claim 100 lives. Horse lives. Who knows how many people, but horse lives I'm talking about. Heat stroke was a major problem for these animals. And the problem was stable owners didn't really have to promptly remove these things. There were actually a whole different group of people called haulers who were paid by the ton. So they waited until decomposition softened the tendons of the dead horse, and then they would hack the carcass into movable chunks. So we're basically spilling blood and guts and horse body parts all over the road after they died, and then we're hauling them away. But it doesn't stop with horses dying. Well, yeah, it does, but it doesn't. It starts with horses pooping, okay? That's what I'm trying to say. The average horse produces anywhere from 15 to 35 pounds of manure per day. Now go ahead and just multiply that by tens of thousands of horses clopping through the cities, and you're suddenly staring down over 3 million pounds of horse crap every single day. And then you've got horses pissing. The average horse produces roughly 6 to 10 gallons of piss a day. 40,000 gallons of horse piss every day hitting the streets. Can you imagine the smell? And this is at a time when indoor plumbing wasn't really a big deal. That is correct. Toilets weren't really a thing in most households. There was a lot of outhouses. So there's a lot of shit outside, basically. Human waste on top of horse waste, on top of bodies, piles of it, rivers of it. And naturally, as you'd expect, this caused regular outbreaks of typhoid and cholera and dysentery. This was horrible. All sorts of plagues were coming out of here. It was a slow motion health disaster fermenting in plain sight. And it got so bad that some of these cities in this time were saying that if we don't solve this horse problem, we're all going to be buried under 9 feet of horse manure within 50 years. And this caused a great panic, as you can expect. And it actually had a name. It's called the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894. So to solve this, they started dumping all of this stuff in waterways and the ocean. But the problem was all the body parts and defecation just came back onto the shores. It was a real problem. So then we started burning everything, and that caused pollution, all that kind of stuff. So I know we beat this dead horse, but let's wrap it all up, this point here. So there's no OSHA, there's no rules, there's dead animals everywhere, there's crap everywhere, there's people who are also dying in this time, especially slaves and children. The environment is completely obliterated. Forests have been absolutely clear cut. Rivers are dammed up and poisoned and filled with death. The air is filled with coal smoke and the smoke of bodies and manure burning. There's just a generally black smog hanging in the air over many of these cities because trash was also burned in the streets. There were wood fires everywhere. Pollution's at an all-time high. But if you look at the way of doing things today, it's way different. Virtually everything blue collar, and honestly everything nowadays, is wrapped in all of this BS bureaucracy. There you got red tape, endless meetings, training videos, lawsuits, safety contracts, waivers, like all this stuff that we become so risk averse and profit oriented that now all this stuff, we can't do it in the same way we did it back then. And that also makes it much slower. It's not saying that system back then was more efficient and better. But it was faster because we didn't give a crap about anything. But now we have to. And also we're more oriented towards profit. So companies are gonna take longer to do projects because it makes them more money. So when people say, how could they have built all this back then? A readily available supply of materials, cheap materials, a readily available supply of, at a minimum, 10 million laborers who are our slaves, at a minimum, 100,000 horses possibly, up to 200,000 horses per city, and we don't care if they die, an uncontrollable flow of immigrants who literally come here just for the purpose of building our cities, and we don't know how many millions of them there were because they didn't stick around. How did they build all the cities? That's how. The 1800s were a meat grinder, guys, not some utopia filled with advanced tech. America chewed through bodies in the name of industry and expansion and speed. You guys think things move fast now? You should have seen it back then. Imagine going to bed and you wake up and there's a new building on your block. The mission was speed. Only later it morphed into money. And that's why today it takes 20 years to fix or repair the same basilica that they built in 5 years, right? That's the infrastructure way nowadays. And that's BS, but it's the same way for medicine. It's the same day for everything. Look at our healthcare. We don't heal fast. They even prolong that process nowadays. It's just that it's all about money, guys. There's also just the fact that people back then just knew how to build faster. They were just better builders because they weren't reliant on electricity. They weren't reliant on all the stuff that we have today. They didn't have any of the red tape, and they had all of the skills because this was often like a master builder or an architect. This would be their trade. And so they were very efficient at construction. They knew how to build. Almost everybody. If you were a real man, you knew how to put some stuff together, typically, especially if you were in this business. Men were raised swinging hammers, cutting lumber, and pouring mortar. They had a whole different type of work ethic back then. So, as a matter of fact, that's why you might hear people say they don't build things like they used to. It's true. I'll reiterate, this past was not some utopia. It was cutthroat. It was violent. But that also meant things got built fast and cheap. Doesn't mean Tartaria itself doesn't exist, but it does mean that we shouldn't overlook the brutal reality of how the US was built. Sometimes it's just hard men with calloused hands, nothing to lose, and an extreme work ethic. This is the United States, right? So picture yourself as a member of the United States back then. You just shocked the world. You got your independence 75 years ago. We're in a sort of shaky kind of way because of some things going on internally, gearing up for a civil war and stuff. And I'm sure news of this is kind of spreading all over the world. We are one of the last countries to abolish slavery, so I think we're kind of just like kind of confused about that a little bit, and I think the rest of the world is too a little bit. But we can't look like a weak nation or a dirty nation or a violent nation, a nation of vagabonds and slaves and lawbreakers. We can't look like we don't have a civilization worth being part of the world, essentially, the civilized world. This cannot be what America looks like. Not after all we've done to gain some respect and notoriety and independence. So that's absolutely everything we've been talking about. That's absolutely not how the narrative is going to tell the story to the rest of the world in these times. The narrative must tell the story of a beautiful American land of promise and opportunity. Look how clean it looks. Listen to how pristine it sounds. And you can read about how wondrous it is in our newspapers. And look, we've even got some photos of it. And of course, none of these testaments are saying anything about the massive amounts of slave labor and dead bodies in the streets, the pollution in the air. It doesn't say anything about the fact that you look out your window and you see a muddy cesspool with a dead horse here, some human turds over here, off in the distance, if you can even see off in the distance because of all the smoke in the sky. You might see a forest that's been chopped down with just stumps remaining. They don't tell you that that's what it looks like in these articles. It doesn't say anything about the cruel and sort of underprivileged conditions of the immigrants. It says nothing about the crime, because we couldn't paint the United States in that light, the government especially, the media. We need labor. We need immigrants. We need people to want to come here. This is going to be how we grow our wealth. It's going to be how we get the economy booming. This is going to bring more voters and expand our borders. It's going to grow our political power and our military, thus ensuring that we will never be under the boot heel of a country like England again. This is important to the nation. So we cannot look like this is a sort of nasty, murderous, corpse-filled, dangerous cesspool. Because first of all, that's not what we are as a people. This was just a transitional period. But also, we need these people from Europe to want to come here. And so there was a great desire to make the US look a lot like Europe and look very clean and awesome. And it worked. So that brings us to one of the real issues of this whole thing: photography. Photography has been able to be modified since the moment we invented photography. Photoshop has existed for as long as the camera has existed. Let's get deeper into that, because the tricky thing with photography is that truth. We say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but it's also incredibly easy to fake. And that kind of renders the story a bit muddy. But that's the whole paradox when you think about it. Photos are blatant lies and obvious truths at the same time when you look at the photos from this time frame. And that contradiction is kind of a massive problem, because you have the Tartarians saying, see, the photo manipulation is proof that they're hiding something. And they are, in fact, hiding something. Filth, death, smog, pollution, slavery, children, orphans, working on buildings, all that kind of stuff. That's what they're hiding. They're not hiding Tartarian kingdoms. Let's get on with it. So with photography in the US, specifically in the window between the 1800s and early 1900s, I don't need to go in huge detail on this, but we find ourselves staring at what looks like another smoking gun. Because yes, we did have many hundreds of thousands of edited photos coming out of this time. And the thing about film is you can scratch it and you can damage it during the process of taking pictures. And not only did we figure this out, but we also figured out that it takes considerable time for a photo to be taken back in these old days. It could take up to 5 minutes for a photo to be taken sometimes. And that's due to something called exposure, because the technology hadn't advanced to iPhones yet. So yeah, it took time to take a photo and for the photo to appear. If you guys have ever used a Polaroid camera, you have a small picture of what that looks like. But now imagine it in the ancient capacity. When it was first invented, it's gonna be slower, clunkier, heavier. But because that they figured out that they could modify the photos, photographers basically became storytellers a lot of the time, and they loved that. Some of these photographers from the 1800s would even put fake ghosts in their pictures, and people called it spirit framing or something like that, and it's spirit photography. And it was literally just this one guy who would go out here and he would have a frame ready to insert, and it would basically create an image of somebody getting their picture taken, and over their shoulder, a ghost. This was back in the 1800s, guys. And this continued. And by the time we get to World War I, you see how photographic manipulation is completely mastered. But I'm gonna call myself out here, right? Because if I'm making the case that there should be dead horses everywhere and horse crap piled 9 feet in the air and all that, down every single road, and slaves everywhere building these buildings, and all these construction photos that should be showcasing this labor in effect, where are all those photos? And the answer is the photos are lying. This is known, verified fact, but we don't agree on what the lie is. I'm saying all that nastiness and embarrassing details, they were all cut out. And they were replaced with pristine streets. And they were replaced with fake people. People that are real, but were photographed at a different time and then stitched into the film photography. And then this was mass produced, put in newspapers, and spread all over the whole world, and you couldn't even tell it was fake because it was black and white on newspapers. Extremely low resolution. The lowest resolution. So you see from all of this that even the things that they were showcasing in photos were not real. But they weren't hiding advanced technology or a Tartarian race or Nephilim or angels. They were hiding the filth and the disgusting backgrounds of our cities that were constantly under construction and constantly filled with manure and death and slavery. To understand what photo manipulation is in these times, you have to do a little bit more research. And what you find is that media companies would have entire teams of people who would process these photos to the desired result. So you'd have the guy who takes the photos, and then you'd have the guy who processes the photos and develops them. And then you'd have the guy who goes in there with a magnifying glass and a scalpel, and then you have a team of artists, and they would paint or stitch in other photos. These cameras were bulky and slow and chemically reactive. They often had liquid and some kind of poison in them, and glass and wood, and it was kind of this arcane, alchemical, dangerous hobby/job. And yeah, not hardly anybody had access to it. So you think governments weren't going to be interested in this kind of power? Of course they were. This was the perfect way to show the entire world that our streets were clean and awesome and highly advanced, because look at how we put up all of these temporary, for the most part, buildings that you should want to come see because they look exactly like your buildings. And it worked. And of course, we're going to edit all the slaves out and all the natives out because we, A, don't want to showcase the savages. Remember how we painted the savages in the Wild West days? We're not going to show us working our kids. What? We're not going to show any of that. So cut all that out. It doesn't look good. And that's why there's such a consistency across all of these old world photos with, the vanilla skies, the whitewashed streets, and the absence of slaves and Native Americans and children being worked. And all the smog, the trash fires, the plaster dust, rotting corpses, wild dogs, buzzards in the skies. You don't see any of that. It's because it's all been cut out. Because the USA could not look like some chump out here rolling with the big dogs. Listen, guys, I know this episode has gone a little bit long. On Friday, I'm going to be reviewing your comments. If some of these arguments are pretty good, we're going to make some follow-up videos because I realize that this conspiracy theory is important to a lot of people. The narrative is still messed up. The timeline is still out of whack. But Tartaria might not be the missing piece to all that. What if there's something else and Tartaria is just a disguise? So, there you go. Don't drink the water, question everything. See you on Friday. Later. I just want to reiterate one thing here that I've said before. I don't like the term conspiracy theorists, and normally I try to avoid using it. I prefer terms like alternative researcher or counter-narrative journalist or independent historian, something like that. There's just better words that don't carry the same negative, dismissive tone as conspiracy theorists. But I'm using it in this video because I do think that if you're not willing to let go of all of this Tartarian madness after seeing the actuality, I do think you are a conspiracy theorist. And I say this with respect as somebody who is questioning the narrative, just like me, but we have to be careful not to turn our history into a sci-fi novel that we're just trying to solve, inventing the story and then trying to fill in all the details so we can prove it. When we latch on to a theory and finally land on a solution that kind of feels right, something that answers the riddle kind of and explains the mystery sort of, it's easy to fall into the trap of declaring that this is the absolute truth. But that's exactly what we criticize science for. Think about it. Modern science, when confronted with competing narratives, tends to settle on the answer that it likes best. Darwin, right? Then science will perform just enough research to essentially validate in its own mind its position and hope that they can prove it, and then they lock that answer in, and now this becomes science because we said so, because we did just enough research to prove something that kind of does exactly what we kind of assumed was going to kind of happen. But that's why so many of us don't trust science as an institution. It stops asking questions once it finds the answer it prefers. But us, we in the alt history and conspiracy space can fall into that same trap. If we find a theory that we like, say the Tartarian origin of the old world American buildings, and then refuse to entertain any other explanation like photography, blueprints, documented building techniques, documented accounts of the building process itself, slavery, Native Americans, immigration, if we forget all of that and we basically act like we are Adam and Eve on this Tartarian planet, that's not research. That's dogma, and that can be just as intellectually lazy as the institutions we criticize. Now, I'm all here for real arguments, let me be clear, but I also want to establish how firmly these facts that I've been presenting stand.